They called it the Leadership Combat Summit, but today it felt more like a spectacle. The room buzzed with the hum of artificial lights and ambition, every seat filled with leaders, CEOs, former military officers, and rising tech stars. At the center of the glossy hardwood stage stood Dante Cross, barefoot, cocky, 32, with a chiseled jaw and a resume full of bold claims. Dante's voice carried like a sermon as he talked about disruption and domination, how fear is the tool of the weak, and that strength earns respect. He wore a black compression shirt that clung to his lean frame, his movements sharp like code written by a machine. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on the old man seated in the second row, Harold Vance. Harold had a quiet posture, hands folded over his stomach and his body straight despite the toll of time. 68 years old, silver crew cut and a chest still broad from years in the Marine Corps. His name was barely on the program, and he was tucked in as a guest speaker on resilience. Dante called him up like a magician picking a volunteer, smiling widely like it was all in good fun, said something about showing that leadership isn't about age or titles but presence. The crowd gave a polite laugh, unsure where this was going. Harold rose slowly, but not weakly. There was a dignity in the way he walked, not rehearsed, just lived. His boots made a low thud on the wood floor as he stepped up. They bowed. Not the deep kind, just enough to nod to tradition. Harold smiled, a warm one, but the kind you give to someone you know is about to make a mistake. Dante didn't smile back. The match started easily, a few light exchanges, nothing dangerous, but then Dante began to press, faster strikes, sharper angles, less room to breathe. Harold blocked and dodged with care, but it was clear his knees weren't what they used to be. Still, he stayed in it, calm, focused. Then Dante swept the leg. Harold fell hard, shoulders smacking the mat with a flat crack. A gasp rippled through the crowd, but Dante didn't stop. He spun and pinned Harold with a knee, locking his arm in a tight grip. Harold didn't fight back. He just looked up, breathing heavily, eyes clear. Dante leaned in and said something only Harold could hear. Whatever it was, it drained the color from the old man's face. Then Dante stood, arms raised, grinning like he'd won a trophy. There was no applause, just a stunned silence. Then a single camera zoomed in on Harold as he sat up, rubbing his shoulder, eyes shining with something between shame and disbelief. Off to the back of the room, nearly hidden behind the rows of executives, sat a man in jeans and a black jacket. He hadn't moved during the match, didn't flinch when Harold hit the floor. Chuck Norris. His face was quiet, unreadable, the kind of stillness that holds 1,000 storms. He didn't look at Dante, he looked at Harold. Someone coughed. A tech founder shifted in his seat. A woman in uniform whispered to the person beside her, but Chuck remained still, hands folded, eyes steady, like he'd just seen a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Dante walked off the mat, full of swagger, shaking hands like nothing had happened. But the energy in the room had shifted. Not angry, not yet, just wrong. Then Harold stood, slowly, brushed off his sleeve, adjusted his belt, and turned toward the crowd. His voice didn't rise. He just said 5 words. This is how respect dies. The room froze. No one moved. Even the cameras stopped panning. And somewhere in that heavy silence, Chuck Norris closed his eyes. Not in defeat, in a decision. Because sometimes a storm doesn't come loudly. Sometimes it waits, slow and steady, until the air is ready to break. Dante Cross wasn't always loud. In his teens, he trained alone most nights, locked in the back of a modest dojo in Cincinnati while other kids were out chasing noise. He wasn't chasing trophies then, he was chasing silence. His mother worked nights as a nurse. His father disappeared before he could walk. The mats became his second skin, and pain became a kind of rhythm he could trust. By 19, he held black belt in 2 disciplines and had a mind wired for pattern. That same discipline carried into his college years, where he double majored in engineering and behavioral psychology. He liked systems. He liked pressure. He launched his first startup out of a basement apartment with 1 broken window and an internet connection that barely held up during video calls. It failed, but his second one didn't. That company tracked stress patterns in executives through biometric wearables and paired the data with customized recovery regimens. It promised leadership through self-mastery. The tech was sound, but what sold it was Dante. He started posting clips of his training sessions, pairing spinning kicks with quotes about control, power, and breaking comfort zones. At first, they were raw, honest, and a little messy, but people liked them. By 28, his channel had over 10 million followers. He wasn't just an entrepreneur anymore, he was a symbol. He called it the Cross Method, a blend of combat science, mental rewiring, and ruthless self-discipline. He said most people live at 40%. He would teach them how to push through the remaining 60. The message hit hard in boardrooms and locker rooms. Soldiers reposted him. Venture capitalists flew him in for closed-door retreats. He started training billionaires how to breathe under pressure and break boards with a single thought. But somewhere along the way, the tone shifted. What began as strength through discipline started to sound more like domination through force. His clips were sharper now, less teaching, more takedowns. He filmed public challenges, spared with influencers and made examples of them, smiled while doing it, and the crowd loved it. Corporate sponsors came in droves. Energy drinks, tech apparel, a streaming deal. He packaged his lifestyle into a subscription model and sold it like salvation. Behind the scenes, critics raised questions. Some said his philosophy confused leadership with control. Others called it ego wrapped in discipline. But most were drowned out by the noise. His fans called them weak, soft, out of touch. They didn't want humility, they wanted heat. Dante kept going, leaner, louder, more polished. He gave keynotes in bare feet and a black gi. He told rooms full of executives that fear is a lie and empathy is a distraction. He wasn't teaching martial arts anymore, he was weaponizing it, turning every movement into a metaphor for power. The truth is, Dante had started out wanting to build something better. He really believed that pressure revealed character. But the cameras changed him. He stopped listening to people who disagreed, surrounded himself with voices that praised him, created his own echo chamber. He used to spar to learn. Now he sparred to dominate. His opponents weren't training partners, they were props. And that's where it turned. Slowly, quietly, but it turned. Because when a man forgets the purpose behind the form, all that's left is performance, and performance, no matter how strong, can't lead anyone. Not for long. The lights in the Austin Convention Hall dimmed just enough to shift the mood. A low hum of anticipation settled across the rows of high-backed chairs, filled with executives, veterans, and thought leaders. Phones rose like a quiet tide as Dante Cross walked barefoot onto the stage. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, centered and still, letting the silence work. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, and confident. He talked about discomfort, about how true leadership is born in pressure, not policy. Said the world doesn't need more thinkers, it needs doers. The screens behind him lit up with clips of him breaking boards, leading sprints through mountain snow, disarming mock attackers in parking lots. The audience watched with a mix of awe and curiosity. He looked like a man carved out of certainty. Then he introduced the Combat Leadership Challenge, said it was a live demonstration of decision-making under tension, called it a gift to the audience. He claimed it wasn't about winning or losing, but about presence under pressure. Still, the way he smiled when he said that made it hard to believe. His eyes scanned the crowd like a predator looking for motion. He asked for volunteers. Not the young ones in suits, not the athletes near the front. He called for wisdom. First up was a retired school principal from Denver, 62, lean but stiff, more comfortable in a lecture hall than on a mat. They bowed, exchanged a few soft moves, and then Dante swept his leg with a clean, quiet motion that sent the man stumbling. The crowd gave a soft chuckle. Polite, uncertain. The principal smiled as he got up, but it didn't reach his eyes. The second was a former pastor who said he'd studied Aikido back in the 70s. He had kind eyes and a belly that showed he hadn't trained in decades. Dante circled him slowly, then landed a shoulder throw that flattened the old man before he could adjust. Applause was thinner now. A few mutters. Some looked at their watches. Others tried to laugh. The third match was worse. A Vietnam vet with a cane had volunteered, saying he just wanted to try. Dante took him down with a hip toss and didn't offer a hand when the man struggled to rise. There was no laughter at that time, only silence. And shifting. Something had turned. The energy had gone tight. Like the room knew this wasn't a lesson anymore. Dante kept his tone light. Said pressure reveals the truth. Said there's no age limit on grit. But grit wasn't what he was showing. Control was. Command. He moved like he owned the space. Bowed just enough to check the box. Talked about respect while undercutting it with every move. Then he scanned the room again. Slowly. Like he was daring someone to step up. Or step in. That's when Harold Vance rose from his seat. No fanfare. No smile. Just a steady push from the arms of his chair. He adjusted his collar, rolled his shoulder once, and walked down the aisle like he wasn't walking into a fight at all. Just another room. Just another moment. Dante's face didn't change, but something in his stance did. Just a flicker, a shift of weight. Harold stepped onto the mat without a word, bowed once, small and sincere. Then he looked Dante in the eye. Not as a challenge, not even as a warning, just as a man who knew exactly what this was. The crowd leaned in, not out of excitement, but because no one quite knew what to expect anymore, and something deep down said they were about to find out. Harold sat on the edge of the mat, rubbing the back of his shoulder with slow, circular fingers. The pain was familiar, but the reason for it was not. He looked out at the room, not for sympathy, just trying to understand what it had become. The staff member crouched beside him, offering ice. He waved it off, not out of pride, but because cold couldn't touch what was sore. It wasn't the muscle that ached the most. Chuck approached without a word, his boots soft against the hardwood floor. He stopped a few feet away, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Harold looked up and gave a short nod, the kind of nod two men share when words are optional. Chuck crouched down, knees cracking just a little, and rested his elbows on his thighs. He didn't ask how Harold was. He already knew. Harold spoke first. Said he remembered when sparring was an act of trust. He once taught kids that you bow before and after, because the fight begins and ends with respect. Chuck let the words hang there for a beat, then said the art hadn't changed, just the people holding it. And some folks didn't know the weight of what they carried. Harold's voice dropped, low and steady. He said power without character just leaves bruises. Chuck nodded, eyes steady, jaw tight. They sat in silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just still. Behind them the crowd had thinned, but the buzz hadn't stopped. Dante was still on the far end of the stage, talking with staff, pacing like he'd won something. But his eyes kept flicking to the back of the room. He noticed Chuck. Took a little longer than it should have, but when he did, his whole rhythm paused, just for a second. Chuck stood slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be, but his presence was. When he straightened, He looked over toward the woman watching from the wings. Clara Mendoza stepped forward, arms crossed, her face unreadable. She wore a blazer over tactical pants, her badge clipped to her belt. She didn't look like someone easily shaken, but there was a tightness around her mouth. Chuck walked over, nodded once. Clara nodded back. She used to train under Dante, back before the cameras. She said. She left after the first live-streamed match that turned into something else. Said it felt like watching someone take a sacred thing and make it cheap. But by then the followers were already pouring in. Chuck asked if she ever called him out. Clara said she tried once, said he laughed, then told her she didn't get it. Chuck's eyes narrowed, just slightly. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He already knew the kind of man who trades discipline for attention. Clara said she started her own thing after that, trains women in de-escalation, close protection and real-world stuff. No branding, no flash. Chuck said she'd done the right thing. Clara looked down, then back at him. Said she wasn't sure if walking away had been brave or just easier. Chuck told her that knowing when to walk and when to stay is two kinds of courage, and sometimes the harder thing is staying close enough to clean up after someone who's lost his way. Meanwhile, Dante kept glancing back. Every few minutes, every few steps, his smile was still there, but thinner now. One of his assistants leaned in to whisper something. Dante waved them off, eyes locked on Chuck. His expression didn't show fear, not yet, just a calculation. Clara noticed it too. Said he doesn't know what to make of you. Chuck didn't answer, just kept watching. The room had changed. Not loud, not chaotic, but unsettled, like something sacred had cracked and no one quite knew what to do about it. Harold had left the mat, walking out on his own. Shoulders square, steps even. The kind of quiet dignity that doesn't need an audience. Chuck followed him with his eyes until he disappeared down the hall, then turned back to Clara. Said the storm was coming. She nodded once and said she'd stay close. Dante stepped to the edge of the stage, scanning the thinning crowd like he was looking for applause that didn't come. His gaze landed on Chuck again, and this time he didn't look away. Chuck tilted his head just slightly, not a challenge, not yet, but a warning. Dante smiled. Too wide, too clean. The kind of smile a man wears when he knows he's being watched. And Chuck knew the time would come. Not now, but soon. Real storms don't arrive with thunder. They arrive in the stillness, right before something breaks. Dante Cross stepped back onto the stage like it belonged to him. His feet moved slowly, deliberately, almost theatrically. The lights shifted, just a little brighter, and the music faded into silence. He stood at center stage and scanned the room like a man looking over a battlefield. His voice came out sharp, clear, and with no hesitation. Said something about moments defining men. The crowd stilled. A few people were still talking in the back, but the front rows had gone quiet. Too quiet. Dante paced once across the mat, then stopped and looked straight into the back of the room. Said leadership wasn't about legacy. It was about presence. He let the silence hang. Then his tone changed, just slightly. He said, some folks cling to old values like their armor. They said they talk about respect and character, but hide when it's time to act. He didn't say Chuck's name, not yet. But heads turned. Everyone knew. Dante smiled. Not warm, not playful, a smile like someone tightening a noose. He said if anyone in the room still believed in discipline, in tradition, in that old school nonsense about honor and restraint, now would be the time to stand up. Then he paused, looked right at Chuck Norris. The shift in the room was sudden. People turned in their seats, phones came up, breaths held. Dante walked to the edge of the mat, lifted a hand and pointed, casual but direct. Said something about heroes turning into statues. said maybe it was time to see if statues could move. Chuck didn't flinch, still seated, still quiet. Dante pushed harder. Those words don't build strength. Said Chuck had built a whole name off stories and legends. He said this was a new era now, and if Chuck believed in anything he stood for, he should come prove it. A few nervous laughs trickled out. No one joined in. Dante turned back to the audience and threw out a hand. I asked if anyone else wanted to see what a real character looks like when tested. More silence. Then he said it, loud enough to echo. Said Chuck could sit there and fade, or he could show them all that integrity still hits back. For a second, it looked like nothing would happen. Chuck stayed seated, still, calm, but his eyes were locked in. The weight of the moment pressed in, not just on Chuck, but on everyone in that room, on the veterans, on the COOs. The young ones were watching with wide eyes. Dante rolled his shoulders and stepped back, said he'd clear the mat, said he had nothing to hide, said if Chuck had something to teach, now was the time. Chuck stood. No fanfare, no speech, just a quiet, steady rise from his chair. The crowd reacted like wind moving through dry grass, not loud, but full of heat. Phones rose higher, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chuck walked forward with slow, even steps, not rushed, not forced, like he was walking into a room he'd been in before. Dante backed up slightly, just enough to give space, just enough to keep the spotlight. Chuck stopped at the edge of the mat. He looked around the room, not at Dante, at the crowd. His voice came low, almost quiet. Said leadership doesn't need to shout. Said it listens first. Dante laughed. Said the floor was open. Said they were listening now. Chuck stepped onto the mat. One foot, then the other. And just like that, the air changed. This wasn't a show anymore. This was something older, something deeper. Something is about to break wide open. Chuck Norris stepped forward without a word. No announcement. No change in the lights. He wore jeans, boots, and a dark jacket. No gi, no belt, just the man. The sound in the room dropped like someone had turned down the world. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the cameras paused, as if unsure what they were allowed to capture. Chuck walked with a pace that didn't need proving. Each step was quiet, but the floor seemed to listen. He didn't rush, he didn't hesitate. Dante stood near the center of the mat, bouncing lightly, stretching his arms like a man about to perform. He smirked, called out something half clever, but no one laughed. The crowd had shifted. Chuck reached the edge of the mat and paused. He slipped off his boots with a slow, practiced motion, then stepped forward, bare feet touching the surface, like he'd never left it. No stance, no posturing. He simply stood there. His eyes met Dante's and held. Not with a challenge, not even anger, just a steady, unblinking stillness. Dante moved side to side now, shoulders loose, arms floating, trying to keep the energy sharp. But the room wasn't on him anymore. It hadn't been since Chuck stood. There was a different kind of silence now, not confusion, not fear, reverence. Chuck lifted his hand and offered a short, respectful nod. Not a bow, just enough to say, "I'm here." Dante gave a mocking version of it back, his grin tight, too rehearsed. He cracked his knuckles like he was winding up. The sound seemed too loud. Someone in the front row whispered something but got shushed. A cameraman held his breath without knowing it. In the far corner, Clara Mendoza stood straighter. Chuck shifted his weight slightly, not into a stance, just into readiness. The crowd felt it, a stillness before motion, a pause before gravity changes. Dante rolled his neck and raised his hands. Harrian smiled again, but there was a flicker now, a hesitation, just enough for someone like Chuck to see it. Chuck didn't move, not yet. But the rune knew it wasn't Dante's anymore. It never had been. Dante moved first, sharp and fast, cutting through the space between them with the confidence of someone used to applause. He threw a spinning kick high and clean, meant to catch Chuck off guard, but Chuck was already gone before the heel reached him. No rush, no stumble, just a quiet shift to the side, like slipping past a door before it shuts. Dante landed, blinked once, and spun into a second strike. This one was low, faster, and aimed for the knee. Chuck stepped back, barely lifting his leg. The kick missed by inches. His hand stayed low, calm, unreadable. The crowd leaned in, not cheering, just watching. Dante kept moving. A quick jab, then a follow-up elbow, slick and calculated. Chuck raised his arm, blocked both without effort, and let Dante's force fold back into itself. There was no resistance in Chuck's body, only direction, like water changing course. Dante circled. His smile was still there, but tighter now. He jabbed again, this time with more force. Chuck didn't flinch. He turned his shoulder and let the punch slide past him like wind missing a sail. His eyes never left Dante's. The younger man shifted gears, faster combinations, a flurry of fists aimed at the chest, jaw, and temple. He was fighting now. Chuck didn't answer with fists. He answered with space, with presence. Every strike Dante threw hit nothing, or met a soft block that led it away, like a river redirected by a stone. Dante's breathing changed. Just a little, but enough. He backed off for half a second, then lunged again, this time aiming for the ribs. Chuck caught his wrist, turned it, and let it go without a counter. The momentum pulled Dante forward. He stumbled, caught himself, and glanced at the crowd. A few people were shaking their heads, others were still, just watching. Chuck stood in the same spot, feet grounded, arms loose, ready but never tense. Dante tried a sweep, low and fast. Chuck hopped over it with the grace of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, landed softly, still not striking. That's when something cracked. Not a bone, not the mat. Inside. Dante stepped back, chest rising harder now. He wiped his brow and tried to laugh it off, but his eyes weren't laughing. Chuck waited. Didn't chase, just watched. Dante rushed in again, more force than form now. A wild hook, a high knee, another elbow. None of it landed. Chuck turned, blocked, redirected, like a teacher waiting for the student to slow down and listen. Dante stepped back again, shoulders heaving. He looked younger now, smaller, like the room had shifted and he wasn't the center anymore. Chuck took one step forward, just one. The energy in the room flipped like a wire had been cut, or lit. And for the first time since the match began, Dante hesitated. Dante roared forward one last time, his fist slicing through the air with everything he had left. His form was still sharp, but the control was gone. It wasn't a technique anymore. It was anger. Chuck turned with the strike, caught the wrist, and stepped in close. His body moved like a current wrapping around a stone. In one smooth motion, Dante's weight shifted, and Chuck guided him to the mat. There was no slam, no force, just redirection and gravity doing the rest. Dante landed hard, shoulder down, legs tangled. Before he could react, Chuck was already above him, kneeling, steady. He pinned Dante's arm, just as Dante had done to Harold. The same holds, the same position, but with none of the pressure. His other hand rested gently near Dante's shoulder, open and relaxed. There was no tension in Chuck's body, only presence. The crowd saw it. They remembered the moment earlier, the humiliation, the silence, and now they saw its mirror. Chuck lowered his head just enough to speak softly. His voice didn't rise, didn't accuse. It settled over Dante like truth. He said this is what power looks like when it remembers its purpose. He said control is not about what you can take, but what you choose not to. He said the hardest part of strength is stopping when you don't have to. Dante didn't move. His breath was fast, his face flushed, but his eyes had changed. He looked up at the man above him and saw something he hadn't seen in the entire match. Mercy. Chuck slowly released the hold, not because he had to, but because he knew when it was time. He stood without flair, without triumph. He offered Dante a hand, not to lift him, to remind him. Dante stared at it for a long moment, then reached up. The contact was brief, but everything shifted with it. The room, silent until then, began to stir. No cheers, not yet, but something deeper, a slow, rising respect. A few stood, then more, then the whole room. No one clapped at first. They just stood in silence, in witness. Chuck turned to them with calm eyes. No speech, no gesture, just stillness. What he showed didn't need explaining. It had been lived, right there, on that mat. And in that quiet, a lesson finally landed. Not in force, but in restraint. Chuck stood tall, eyes steady, then turned and walked toward the edge of the mat. His steps were quiet, unhurried, the same way he had arrived. No victory pose, no glance back. Behind him, Dante remained on his knees. He didn't wipe his face or speak, he just stared at the spot where Chuck had been, hands resting on his thighs, chest rising slowly. The silence in the room stretched, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, like everyone was still catching up to what they had just seen. A few people stood, then more, not fast, not loud, just rising. They didn't clap at first, they just watched him walk. Every pair of eyes followed him. Chuck stepped off the mat and pulled on his boots. Took his time. No one moved around him. He nodded once to Clara Mendoza, then started for the exit. She didn't speak. She just exhaled, like something heavy had just been lifted. Near the back of the room, a small voice broke the stillness. A boy, maybe 8, leaned close to his father. He asked what had just happened. The father watched Chuck's back as he answered. Bayad said that's what wisdom looks like when it's stronger than pride. The boy didn't reply, but he kept watching. Chuck reached the doors and paused. Not for the crowd, for Harold Vance, who now stood just inside the hallway, arms crossed, eyes glassy. Chuck gave him a small nod. Harold nodded back. The applause came slowly. Not the wild kind, the kind that starts in the chest and moves to the hands like it has nowhere else to go. No one cheered, they just clapped, steady, soft, deep. Dante was still on his knees, breathing quietly now. His face had changed. Not broken, but cracked open. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't performing, he was thinking. And as Chuck Norris walked out of the room into the quiet hallway beyond, the room behind him held its breath, like something sacred had passed through. Not a fight, not a show, just a lesson, one that would stay. The video went online before the chairs were even cold. First it hit the martial arts forums, where people argued over footwork and timing, but by the next morning it was on every screen that carried news. Not because it was flashy, but because it wasn't. There was no knockout, no slam, just Chuck Norris walking off the mat after choosing not to win. Clips of Dante shouting, striking, and collapsing into silence were stitched into every timeline, but the moment people paused on, the one they kept replaying was the still frame of Chuck kneeling, speaking softly, and letting go. It didn't need sound. News anchors tried to explain it. Some said it was a masterclass in discipline. Others called it the death of ego in real time. Leadership coaches used it the next week in workshops. They stopped talking about vision boards and started talking about restraint. In one corporate seminar, a former Navy officer played the video in silence, then said only one sentence. "That's what control looks like." Martial arts schools reopened old lessons. Bow deeper, slow the form, feel before force. In dojos from Portland to Kyoto, instructors brought back the kata that focused on breath. Some rewrote their student pledges. Not to be stronger, to be steadier. The flood of requests came fast for Chuck. Interviews, panels, endorsement deals. Every network wanted a soundbite. He didn't give them one. He didn't post. He didn't speak. He just went home. Back to his quiet life. Same house, same rhythm. The world spun louder, but he stayed where he was. Some folks called it a missed opportunity. Others said it made the moment even stronger, because in a world hungry for spectacle, he had given them silence, and in that silence they found meaning. Dante disappeared from the public eye. His team shut down the branded content. No new uploads, no statements. Some thought it was a shame. Others thought it was a reflection. No one really knew. A week later, a grainy photo surfaced of Dante leaving a small gym in New Mexico. No cameras, no entourage, just him. People stopped talking about him after that, not with hate, with space. The internet moved on, but not completely. The clip stayed pinned on pages that usually moved fast. It became more than a viral moment. It became a reference. In boardrooms, in classrooms, in quiet corners of the world where power still means something. And maybe that was the most surprising part, that a single moment with no finish and no fight still found a way to last. The morning was quiet when Dante showed up outside Clara Mendoza's training hall. He wore a hoodie pulled low and carried no bag, no phone, no press, just a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket and the weight of where he'd been. Clara saw him through the glass, but didn't open the door right away. She watched him stand there for a full minute, hands at his sides, eyes steady but unsure. When she finally stepped outside, she said nothing at first. He didn't speak either, just nodded once, like asking permission without words. Then he said he was ready to start over. No talk about his past titles, no pitch, no promises. Clara crossed her arms and tilted her head. Told him it wouldn't be a comeback, not here. It would be a return to the beginning. Dante said, that's what he needed. Then, I added, softer, that it might be the only thing left that still felt honest. Clara gave him a long look, then stepped aside and opened the door. Inside, the space was simple. Mats worn smooth. Walls were bare except for one framed quote that read, "Stay quiet long enough to hear your own shadow." She handed him a broom first. Not out of punishment, out of rhythm. He swept in silence while the others trained. No one stared, a few nodded. One or two didn't recognize him at all. He didn't correct them. Clara gave him a space in the back. No mirror, no partner. Just slow drills, breath work and footwork like it was day one. He struggled, not with form, but with quiet. With the part of the training that offers nothing back, but still asks for everything. On the third morning he found a small envelope tucked into his locker. No return name, just his own, written in careful handwriting. Inside was a single note. It said that unlearning is not a weakness. It is the rarest kind of strength. See. Dante folded the note and held it for a moment before sliding it back into his jacket. He didn't show it to anyone. The days passed slowly. He kept showing up. He kept sweeping. Clara watched, not for speed or skill, but for stillness. For the moment, the noise inside him began to settle. One afternoon, after drills, she sat beside him and said, "Leadership isn't something you walk in and claim. You earn it by walking in quietly and letting others speak first. He nodded, said he hadn't earned the right to speak yet. Clara smiled and said that was the first true thing he'd said all month. They didn't talk about Chuck, not directly, but Dante mentioned a moment on the mat, said it had felt like being seen for the first time and not admired. Clara told him, "That's the moment every real student meets themselves, not in the win, but in the mirror left behind." Dante trained, not for crowds, not for brand deals, just for breath. One step, one lesson, one slower day at a time. And little by little, the man who once built an empire out of noise began to learn the language of silence, the kind that leads, the kind that heals. The gym floor was clean, sunlight stretching across the mats through dusty windows. Kids laughed and shuffled into loose lines, their small feet bare and eager. Clara knelt to adjust a young boy's stance, her tone soft but firm. Dante stood at the side, counting breaths with a girl who kept losing focus. He didn't correct her harshly, just gently tapped the rhythm of her breathing with hers. There were no cameras, no speeches, just a slow, steady energy that filled the space like warm air. The wall behind them held one framed quote, not flashy, just simple letters on plain paper. Power begins where ego ends. Some of the parents stayed in folding chairs sipping coffee, smiling at how quiet it all was. Others had joined the practice, moving through slow forms beside their children. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Dante moved without a rush. His steps were grounded, and his voice was even. He had stopped calling anything a lesson. Now he just shared time. Clara led a short bow at the end of class. The children lined up, clumsy but proud, their small hands pressed together as they thanked the room. Dante bowed with them, not as a teacher, but as part of something larger. Near the back, the door creaked open. Chuck stepped in, wearing a jacket too warm for the day and a ball cap pulled low. He didn't speak, he just watched. He stood there for a minute, maybe two. His eyes scanned the mat, rested on Clara, then on Dante. He saw what he needed to see. No one noticed him leave. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't want it. The door clicked shut behind him, quiet as a breath. Inside, the mats were still warm and the children were already laughing again. Clara turned toward the wall and smiled. Dante did too. There was nothing to celebrate, just something to continue.